The candles were lit, every single one of them. It was All Saints' Day and the holiest morning of the Catholic calendar, and every church in Lisbon was packed. Flowers covered the altars, incense filled the nave. 200,000 people were beginning their day in prayer, because that is what you did in Lisbon in 1755. You prayed. You trusted the stone walls around you. You trusted the city. Then, at precisely 9:40 in the morning, the ground moved. Not like a tremor, like a machine breaking. Cracks 5 meters wide split open the streets. The church ceilings came first, then the walls, then the towers. The candles lit for God tumbled into the wreckage and started burning. And 30 minutes later, as survivors fled toward the river for open air and safety, the Atlantic sent back a 6-meter wall of water to meet them. What they did not know, as they ran toward the sea, was that the sea was already coming for them. In this video, we use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings and engravings of Lisbon to life. Moving through the city as it stood before November 1st, 1755, shifting perspective through its medieval streets, and witnessing the collapse and reconstruction through the eyes of artists who were there. Images frozen for centuries, now moving. Let's reconstruct what happened. Lisbon in 1755 was a machine of extraordinary precision. One of the wealthiest ports on the Atlantic, arguably the wealthiest. Gold from Brazil flowed through its docks in volumes that stunned European rivals. Spices from India, sugar from the colonies, timber from the empire's edges. All of it converged here before being distributed across the continent. The city held roughly 10% of Portugal's 3 million inhabitants within its walls. Its merchant class was among the most powerful in Europe. 2 centuries of deliberate imperial engineering had produced the infrastructure connecting Lisbon to the world. Trade routes, diplomatic networks, colonial supply chains, all radiating outward from this one city on this one estuary. It functioned like a beating heart. And like any heart, everything depended on it continuing to beat. But the city itself had grown without a plan. Medieval Lisbon was a labyrinth. Narrow streets folded into narrower alleys. Buildings pressed against each other, creating dense warrens of timber and plaster, accumulated over centuries with no engineering code, no grid. Churches had been built tall and heavy, structurally optimized for visual grandeur, not for survival. The wealth of the empire had poured into the decoration of a city whose foundations had never been properly interrogated. The system looked solid. It was not. The fractures were always there, simply invisible, until November the 1st. The earthquake's epicenter was in the Atlantic, approximately 320 kilometers southwest of the city, along the Azores-Gibraltar fault line. Scientists estimate the magnitude between 8.5 and 9.0, among the largest seismic events in recorded European history. 3 distinct shock waves arrived over roughly 10 minutes. The first cracked the city, the second brought the walls down, the third finished what remained standing. 3.5 minutes of shaking. Enough time for centuries of accumulated architecture to compress into rubble. The physics were precise and merciless. Heavy stone facades with timber interior frames were catastrophically mismatched to lateral seismic force. The walls cracked at their weakest points first. Doorframes, window openings, structural joints. Then the facades separated from the interiors. Then everything came down. Churches were particularly lethal, tall, filled with people, decorated with heavy stone ornaments. The candles on the altars tumbled into the wreckage. Fires ignited in dozens of locations simultaneously, and because the streets were too narrow and too cluttered with debris, the fires spread without resistance. For 5 days, Lisbon burned. The survivors ran toward the river. Open ground, away from collapsing structures. Rational. But 40 minutes after the first tremor, the Atlantic returned what the tectonic rupture had displaced. A 6-meter tsunami reached the harbor in 3 waves. The first drained the riverbed. Survivors stood on the exposed mud, confused by the sudden recession. Then the sea came back. It swept through the harbor, through the lower city, through the open plazas where people had gathered believing they were safe. Thousands who had escaped the buildings died in the water. First the shaking, then the fires, then the sea. By the end of that week, somewhere between 15,000 and 50,000 people were dead. The royal palace was gone. The opera house was gone. The great library with its 70,000 volumes was gone. The courts, the hospitals, the merchant infrastructure, gone. The system had not weakened gradually. It had met a force outside the parameters it was built to handle, and it collapsed completely. In a morning, with no mechanism to slow the fall, then came the question that reveals what a civilization actually is. Not the disaster. What happens after it? The king, Joseph I, had survived by accident. He had left the city at dawn for a country holiday. When he saw the ruins, something broke in him that never healed. He never slept inside a building again. He spent the rest of his life in a vast complex of tents on the hills of Judah, permanently displaced from his own capital, a king of Portugal living in a tent, while his city waited. Into that vacuum stepped one man, Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo, known to history as the Marquis of Pombal. When asked what was to be done, he answered without hesitation, "Bury the dead and heal the living." No theology, no waiting for divine explanation. Action. Pombal overruled the church, which demanded individual Christian burials for every victim, and ordered the dead loaded onto damaged ships and burned at sea. He established price controls to prevent merchants from profiting on emergency scarcity. He deployed the military to maintain order. And then he did something no official had done after any previous earthquake in history. He sent questionnaires to every parish in the country. Precise, secular, entirely factual questions. What time did the earthquake begin? How long did the shaking last? Did the sea rise first or recede first? No mention of God. No theological framework. Strictly observable, verifiable, physical data. The 646 responses that came back, archived to this day in the Torre do Tombo National Archive, became the first systematic seismological survey in recorded history. A disaster transformed, by bureaucratic precision, into a database. Then the rebuilding. The chief engineer, Manuel de Maya, presented 5 options to the Crown within 5 weeks. From restoring the medieval footprint to razing the Baixa entirely and starting from scratch. Pombal chose the last option. Every crooked alley, every centuries-old structural compromise, erased. In its place, a grid, wide, straight streets intersecting at right angles, standardized building dimensions, prefabricated components, and beneath those facades, something Lisbon had never had before, an engineered skeleton. The Pombaline cage, a wooden internal frame designed to absorb seismic force, flexing without fracturing. Engineers built scale models and tested them by marching soldiers around the perimeter, simulating ground vibration. The buildings that rose from Lisbon's ruins were the first systematically earthquake-resistant buildings in European history. When someone asked Pombal why the new streets were being made so wide, he answered without pause, "One day they will be small." The traffic of modern Lisbon proved him right. In less than a year, the debris had been cleared. Within 2 decades, the new Baixa was complete. The medieval capital was gone. In its place stood something that had never existed in Lisbon, a planned city, rational, legible, engineered. But Pombal was not only rebuilding streets, he was dismantling a power structure the earthquake had cracked open. The Jesuits, who had dominated Portuguese education and colonial administration for 2 centuries, had responded to the disaster with theological explanation, God's punishment for a sinful city. Pombal responded by expelling them from Portugal entirely in 1759. He concentrated governance in the secular state apparatus he controlled. The earthquake had destroyed the physical infrastructure of the old order. Pombal used the Reconstruction to dismantle its political infrastructure as well. Reason over tradition, data over doctrine, engineering over prayer. The scar is still visible today. Walk through Alfama, the old Moorish quarter on the hill which survived because its elevation kept it above the flood, and you walk through pre-1755 Lisbon, ancient, dense, unplanned. Then walk down into the Baixa, and you walk through the city that rose from the disaster. Straight lines, regular facades, rational geometry, 2 Lisbons, separated by a hill and by catastrophe, occupying the same city. The ruins of the Carmo convent, left deliberately unroofed as a memorial, preserve the exact silhouette of what was lost. The sky visible through its empty stone arches is the earthquake's permanent signature on the skyline. What collapsed on November 1st, 1755, was not a weak system. It was wealthy, globally connected, embedded in centuries of accumulated practice. It was destroyed because its standards had never been tested at that magnitude. The medieval city had no mechanism for imagining a magnitude 9 event. It built as though the ground were permanent. It invested its surplus in decoration rather than resilience. The fractures were always there. The earth simply made them visible. A survey sent to 646 parishes, wooden models tested by marching soldiers, a grid replacing a labyrinth, one man treating catastrophe as an engineering problem rather than a theological judgment. That approach was not standard in 1755, it was radical. The question worth sitting with is whether the systems we have built today, dense, globally connected, optimized for efficiency rather than resilience, carry their own invisible fractures, whether they have mechanisms for imagining their own failure modes, or whether they are like medieval Lisbon, waiting for a test they were never designed to pass. I am Tom, reconstructing how civilizations built the conditions for their own collapse, and on rare occasions, built something more durable from the ruins. And together, we keep history alive. If there is another system you want to examine, another architecture of disaster, another moment when everything that seemed permanent suddenly wasn't, leave it in the comments. I'll see you in the next era.